Another one of these key identifiers is gender. So Newman poses the question, how do you know if someone is male or female? And when I ask students in my class, I generally get the same response that Newman does. Look to the chromosomes. Females are XX and males are XY. But we know that some people's external primary and secondary sex characteristics don't match their chromosomes. And we don't ask people what their chromosomes are. For the most part, we determine by looking at them and getting clues from a variety of characteristics, some physical and others behavioral. And it's at this point that Newman wants us to consider the fact that we often confuse sex and gender. So in Newman's own words, sex is typically used to refer to the biological markers of maleness or femaleness. These indicators can be chromosomes, sex glands, hormones, internal sex organs, genitalia, reproductive capability, germ cells produced, or secondary physical characteristics, such as wide hips and breasts for females, facial hair, and low-pitched voices for males. Gender, on the other hand, designates the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of masculinity and femininity. People are not born with a gender, they cultivate it over time as they learn the cultural meanings and expectations associated with being a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. While conceptions of biological sex are fairly consistent, conceptions of gender vary enormously. How you're supposed to look and the things you're expected to do by virtue of being labeled male or female are entirely dependent on the societal, historical, and even the familial context in which you live. Sex may be a status ascribed to us at birth, but gender is something that we achieve through the process of conforming to and reinforcing broader cultural expectations. So we look to the biological, meaning that the sexual characteristics that we can observe, as well as the gender-based cues. Now, not everyone seems to have a strong need to know what sex or gendered person they are interacting with, but many of us do. And the great question here is, why is it that we even seem to care about that? I think it's because sex tends to be a primary identifier. We make a lot of assumptions about a person's sex. We place them in the social world, we assign them status, and make assumptions about the person based on their sex. And beyond the personal need to know what sex someone is, there is the fact that society assigns roles and has expectations that are associated with the male or the female sex. We do gender according to how society teaches we are to do it. Children are taught that certain behaviors are more acceptable for males or females, and that society reinforces these norms and expectations. Sex is often thought of in terms of males and females. It's so much easier, albeit the mentally lazy way of doing social constructs, it's so much easier to create dichotomies and make them mutually exclusive categories. Newman highlights the term sexual dichotomies. So Newman helps to introduce you, and if you're not aware, at least sensitize you to the idea that there are more than two sexes. We tend to think in terms of the XX chromosomal female and the XY male. He challenges the reader to think in terms of where in this dichotomy one would put transsexuals, intersexuals, and those with biological ambiguity. He wants the reader to consider the case of gender benders and transsexuals, who often challenge the traditional notions of gender and sex. The idea that you're born with certain physical traits, that you should assume certain roles, and display your gender in a certain way, that's challenged by the concept of those that are gender benders. This is something that occurs in many societies, and that is so common in some societies that there is a certain label for those that gender bend in a certain way. Different societies have different rules for these categories of peoples, which is illustrated in Newman's discussion of the various categories of gender benders. Intersexuality challenges the notion of sexual dichotomies as well. A little less than 2% of all children are born with some form of intersexuality. Until about 20 years ago, the medical practice was to recommend that the parents have the child surgically reassigned at birth. Because it's so much easier to do a reduction, that meant that most children were assigned as a girl. However, some children did not adjust well to that assignment. Those children that had gone through difficulties in adult life adjusting to this, and their families, were part of a grassroots movement in the 1990s to put pressure on the medical establishment to stop the practice of assigning children at an early age to one sex or the other. Now the more common practice is to wait and see and allow the child to be the driver of the decision at about the time they would be entering puberty.